Good afternoon. This is Michelle Lambert. I'm the Communications Director with Move to End Violence. I'm glad you all could be here with us today. Move to End Violence is a 10-year program of the Novo Foundation designed to help all of us working to end violence against girls and women to be better at our jobs. As part of our work with Move to End Violence, we're investing in research to expand the movement's understanding of what captures attention and motivates action on issues related to violence against girls and women. In 2012, we kicked off this research with a national public opinion survey that we conducted with Lake Research Partners. The goal of this was to create a baseline so we could have an understanding of what attitudes were about this issue. We learned, luckily, that many people are in support of this issue. But we also learned that people aren't willing to take action. So in 2014, we decided to focus our research on trying to understand why. What is holding people back from taking action? And what could we do to help them overcome those barriers? Today, we're going to be sharing with you a guide that we've been working on with Springboard Partners. It's a guide that takes this information that we learn and puts it into digestible, actionable items that you can incorporate into your daily work. Here's what we're going to share with you today. First, Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners and one of the leading progressive pollsters, is going to share the insights from the 2014 research. We'll pause after Celinda and have a question period, and then we'll turn it over to Danielle Lewis. Danielle's the principal of Springboard Partners, and she's the one that we've been working with on this. Her company helps nonprofits and foundations use communications to do more good. She'll share recommendations for how to apply this to your daily work. And Danielle will be joined by two members of the Move to End Violence community, Ilene Stohl and Patti Tototzintle. Ilene is the Director of Prevention with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Patti is the CEO of Casa de Esperanza, based in Minnesota. Both of them will share their own experiences as how they've applied these recommendations to their work. We'll end with plenty of time for questions and discussions, so take notes of things you want to ask. Before we dive in, I want to offer a couple of technology notes. First of all of you participants are muted at this point. We will unmute you during the question and answer period so that you can participate. Of course, you're encouraged to participate in the chat bar, as many of you already are. Also, you will notice that we all are on webcam, and that's so that you can see us. But this makes the slides slightly smaller. If you would like to do away with our webcams and enlarge your slides, feel free to do so. Just toggle over the right-hand corner of your slide and enlarge it. I think that's all for now, and I'm going to turn it over to Celinda Lake. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I really want to thank the entire community, the people represented on this webinar, the MEV cohorts for their enormous input and help in this work, and then Danielle and Michelle's incredible talent in helping design how to present it in the most effective way. And I want to thank everyone on this call for the unbelievable work that you do every day and the unbelievable difference that you make. I also want to acknowledge our team, Alicia, Kate, and Flora, who were the Yo women behind this work and have been part of this ongoing effort with MEV and Novo from the beginning. So first, a word on methodology. This research was very comprehensive, and I want to thank Novo for their generosity in making it so. This included focus groups and an online survey. The focus groups were in Georgia, California, and Minnesota. The survey was 1,400 adults nationwide. It included voters and non-voters. It included people, attentive public, people who are engaged more in their communities. It included samples of African Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, and the white community. The survey was offered in Spanish, Cantonese, and Vietnamese. So this was an attempt to really be more comprehensive and more representative of the many, many communities that you all work in. Having said that, this was just the beginning, and there's more in-depth work and more application of this and feedback that we want to get from you based on applying these results and what you do day to day. The 6 focus groups we conducted were among Latinas, African American men and women, Asian Pacific Islander women, white women, and Native American women. So again, thanks to everyone in the MEV cohort and de novo for making such a comprehensive and full look at this issue possible. There were 3 top-line findings from our research. First, people care about this issue, and they have real hope that it can be stopped. And we want to build on that hope. People felt hopeful and inspired. People and the messages and the approaches that work their best built on that hope and inspiration, not on negative feelings or the problem. 2, there's a very strong desire to help, but there are clear barriers to action. And we're going to talk a lot about those, and we explored them in detail and trying to find out what are the real barriers, what are the barriers we can do something about, and what are the barriers that exist that are hard to do something about. And then we looked at how do we get people involved? What are very specific ways in which we can make this easier and overcome those barriers? And we found 3 top issues were tell people very specifically how they can help, give them the support they need to act. They don't often have the foundation that they need to act to take action today, and meet people where they are. And that means meet people in this enormous, complex, and diverse world that we're in, where they are in their community as well as where they are personally. So let's go through the findings, and then as Michelle mentioned, we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end of the research. So our research showed that people know that violence against women and girls is a real problem. They reject the idea that it's part of human nature, that it can't be stopped, that it's caused by mental illness. They are hopeful that we can end it, but they believe that it occurs everywhere in our society. People care and have hope that it can be stopped, and a lot of people have been personally affected. 53% of all adults feel personally connected to this issue of violence against girls and women. 68% believe that this should be a priority addressed in their own community, but only 22% believe that it is a top priority. Other issues are pushing this issue out, not the least of which is the economy, and people feel that there are real challenges to being engaged in this issue. It's not support that's our challenge, it's intensity that is our challenge. How do we get people more intensively engaged to move forward? 3/4 of people feel hopeful that we can end violence against women and girls. 66% pick hope out of all of the possible emotions as their top emotion when they think about this issue. Another 55% pick inspired. This was one of the most surprising findings for us, frankly, that people were so hopeful about the future and so hopeful about dealing with this issue, and that is a very strong platform for our movement. We tried statistics, and we all know that there are limits to facts. The statistics here are quite vivid in this movement, and they caught people's attention. People were very struck by the statistics that 40% of teenage girls, 14 to 17, say they know someone their own age who's been hit or beaten by a boyfriend, and that 95% of attacks are unreported, making sexual assault the, quote, silent epidemic. Sexual assault remains the most drastically underreported crime. 9 out of 10 adults found those two statistics concerning. 60% plus found them very concerning. But while they increase people's attention, what they don't do is increase people's sense of action. So we did a very, very interesting experiment And we have the teenage girl statistic on the left and the silent epidemic statistic on the right. And the first bar, the darker bar, is people, how willing you are to take action if you heard the statistic. The bar on the right is how willing are you to take action if you did not hear the statistic. And even though people describe these statistics with very vivid language, sad, shocking, shameful, neither of these statistics increase the priority that people put on this issue. It did not increase their willingness to take on the problem. And what we found is that people found the statistics kind of negative and actually depressing when they wanted to be made to feel more hopeful. They also know this is a problem. They don't need to be educated in that this is a problem. And as dramatic as these statistics were and got their attention, they thought it was still news, maybe not of the magnitude, but news they already had. What they want to hear are the solutions. What they want to hear are inspirational messages. They want to hear that they can make a difference. But they also want to know what kinds of actions are we asking them to take, and they want to be provided with more tools to take those actions. As obvious as it may seem to us in this community what you can do and how you can do it, it is not at all obvious to the public, even the public personally concerned about this issue, personally compelled by this issue, or knowledgeable about the problem. So people want prevention. Their initial gut reaction is intervention, and that's their kind of go-to response, and it's their go-to intervention. It's their go-to orientation. But what they really, really want to do is break the cycle of violence, and that breaking the cycle of violence, not intervention, reinforces their own personal beliefs that violence can be stopped. People think, though, that if we're going to make a change, the most effective thing will be to start young. And they overwhelmingly want to approach a long-lasting change by teaching our youth the right way to behave, including the stressing the importance of valuing girls and women. The second key value, particularly when people thought about their own communities, was often respect. They believe that respect is key to ending violence, and they thought that that's something that we need to teach and we need to reinforce in our communities as well as for our young people. People, interestingly, like the idea of starting in schools. And part of that was, obviously, if you start in schools, you're starting with young people. They also thought this was a great way to get to the public as well, the parents as well as the children. And they thought this was a public setting where you couldn't just jump into people's homes. You could start in schools and get more involved there with both adults and children. So if that's the context we're operating in, the second thing we looked at was how do we overcome the barriers? People understand the problem, they want to help, they feel personally attached, but there are key barriers that are stopping them. The three top barriers were other issues are more important. 55% of people said other issues are more important. And the economy in particular, and I don't know if you've noticed, but in broader public polling that we're doing, the economy is actually taking a downturn again in people's minds, particularly in blue-collar people's minds. The economy is pushing everything out, and then you have ISIS and terrorism and Ferguson and Baltimore, and the list goes on and on for people. Secondly, people feel they need to know more. They need to be educated. 68% of people said, I need to be educated more. I need to be informed more. I don't know how to start the conversation. I don't know enough about the issue. I don't know what to say. People felt they needed a stronger foundation. And then people thought this was a very difficult issue to bring up with close family and friends. People think that, one, it's going to be emotionally draining and involving. And they're not sure that they're prepared for that. They're not sure they know how to deal with the emotions for themselves and of the people that they may be working with. That was particularly strong in the Asian American community, but across the board. Two, people are nervous about having difficult conversations. They're not sure they know what to say. They're not sure they know how to open them. They're not sure that they know how to get it right and how to handle the conversation, how to be effective in the conversation. And then other people believe in some communities that your safety is at risk as well. The other thing about it being emotionally draining is that it's emotionally draining on multiple levels. It's emotionally draining for the person you're engaging. It may be emotionally draining for yourself and trigger things that you're trying to deal with. It may be emotionally draining for young people. There's just a variety of ways in which people think this is a very difficult and touchy area to engage in, and they may not be well prepared for it. And people also think that bringing up violence can bring about judgment of you personally, judgment of you in the community that may be unwanted. When an act of violence happens to you, it's like you want to be in a witness protection program. You don't want to get out there that it happened to you because people are going to totally shun you. This from an Asian Pacific Islander woman in San Jose. A lot of embarrassment. It's embarrassment. You hate to talk about something that's so horrific that happened to you from a Latina woman in Atlanta. African Americans and Native Americans also extremely, extremely concerned that violence could lead to the community looking bad, and that there were already enough stereotypes about the community across a range without having this added to them. In all of this work, by the way, we are just starting to peel back this very, very complicated onion. And I want to give a shout out here, and I know Patti will talk about it more later, to another study that's been done that we just completed working with Casa de Esperanza called the No Mas study, which was an in-depth look at the Latino community, and particularly Latinas, but across the board. And we found there, for example, in the Latino community, the deportation and losing custody of children a big concern in that community. So there's much, much richness in this study, in the in-depth look that we could do in communities and the number of communities that we were able to look at. But we are just getting started. And it's really, again, a compliment to the NOVO Foundation, the MEV movement, and to all of the cohorts and all of you that we were even able to take this look. So people want it made easier for them to get involved, and they want to be sure that they're going to be effective. And there are 3 steps to making it easier. 1, tell people very specifically how can they help. They want to know very specifically what is the step that you are asking me to take. 2, they want support for them to act. They think they need tools. They need education. They need to be met where they are in their own community, in their own lives. So let's talk about each of these and look first at the fact that people want specific direction and don't know what to do. And by the way, this is true in lots of areas today. People feel like it's overwhelming, everything that they have in their lives, and now everything that's being asked of them, particularly through social media. So they want very specifically to know, what are you asking of me? And let's look at what some of the more successful actions were. People were most willing to talk to children about healthy relationships. And this was independent about whether people had children or not. They were willing to sign a petition. And people think there's power in numbers. And signing a petition is still perceived by people to be an effective way to influence public policy and government. And they wanted to share information, conversation with friends and family, because this is a friends and family issue. It is a community issue. It is a personal issue. And people want to pass on things to others. There were things that people were resoundingly unwilling to do, and they too reflect broader things in our society. So people are extremely short of time and money, and they did not have a lot of willingness to attend a meeting. They want to be told specifically what to do and let's go do it, not go to a bunch of meetings. And they didn't want to be part of meetings. They did not want to donate money. and they did not want to increase their taxes even by $5. Not because they were unwilling to do it, but because they felt that they simply did not have the time or money to do it. There were other things that were in the middle: social media roles in the community, getting in a specific activity with an organization. Those all ranged in the middle. When people were talking about what they wanted to do and the action that they were willing to take, after they were asked to take very specific action, they also felt that they need support for that action. And on the right-hand side, you see the support that was strongest for them: education about the issue, training on how to have conversations, updates on the impact that they had had, and information about what had worked elsewhere, because people don't want to take this on if they don't think they're going to be effective. On the left-hand side were the things that were less likely to generate more support for action: making events fun or working with community leaders. They thought, that's okay, I like doing that, but it doesn't necessarily motivate me more in this area. Those are not my barriers. Now, the one community that was interested in working with community leaders today was the African American community. In the middle was friends and family working as a team, getting a small step that you had a concrete amount of time for, receiving emotional support, and we saw the really big barrier that represents in the previous slide, and someone you know asks you to get involved, which is, of course, how people get involved, period, today. One of the things that we found that was particularly important in the research, if we look at the next slide, is meeting people where they are today. And one of the luxuries we had in this research was the funding to really look in depth at communities, and we were enormously helped by all of the diversity of all of the people in the cohorts and in the community, looking at what works for people. There's much, much more that needs to be done, and we in this webinar can only very, very lightly give you a flavor of what is in this data. And all of this data by community can be made available to you for all of the communities, and we'll hear at the end of the webinar how you can access that. But it's not meant to be the definitive work. It's not meant to be all-encompassing generalizations, because there's lots of diversity within each of these communities. But it is meant to be a start of a much richer look at how we can work with people where they're at. So let's start in no particular order in the African American community. And what we found that was really unique about this community was the really, really strong personal connection that people had on this issue. Almost 7 in 10 African Americans reported feeling personally connected to the issue. People were more in the African community really oriented toward children, but even more oriented toward a campaign that was community oriented. And they loved taking types of action that serve the whole community. Those types of actions included talking to children about healthy relationships, which they saw could occur at a community level, and signing a petition. Respect was a very strong emotion in the African American community. African Americans believing it's absolutely key to ending violence. And even more intensely than other groups, African Americans wanted to know, what steps should I take, where do I get trained, and how do I get updates on the difference that this has made in our community. Asian Pacific Islanders had some of the lowest feelings of personal connection to the issue of all of the communities we surveyed. On the one hand, their feelings of hope were at the highest, but it's a very, very complex emotion and a very complex situation in the Asian Pacific Islander community. And of course, that community is not even remotely monolithic. Some major differences within the community. But people felt overwhelmingly that on the one hand, while they were hopeful in the Asian American community, it was also one of the highest that felt we'll never be able to end violence. People also wanted to be very involved in education. Education, more than a community approach, individual education, education of young people, education in small groups, was really seen as the way to make change, much more so than community involvement, given how people felt the community involvement was more public than that community is prepared to be right now, where they're still seeing this very much as a private issue. The Latino community, feeling a personal connection. In fact, they were second to African Americans and Native Americans, but more than Asian Pacific Islanders. They know more about what to do. They want to know more about what to do to prevent violence, and that was the second highest feeling in any community, that give me the education, give me the foundation, tell me what it's like in my community here in this country. People also, the Latino community, extremely social media oriented in general, and that flowed over here, particularly in campaigns that were community oriented. The Latino community, the most willing in community oriented campaigns to pass off things through social media. Education of young people, also extremely motivating in the Latino community, and people saw that happening in their families and in the schools, where they were very willing to take action. Native American community had the highest personal connection to this issue of any other community. They were very, very adamant about prevention and firmly believed that starting young was key to prevention, and educating boys and girls was key to starting prevention, and it was the highest of any community. They had the second highest willingness to act. The African American community had the strongest willingness to act, but the Native American community right behind it. And they wanted to act in campaigns that were focused on community, but had educating girls and boys as a major component of that campaign. And finally, the white community. The whites reported some connection to this issue, but they were in the middle. Less than African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, more so than the Asian Pacific Islanders. Whites believed overwhelmingly that teaching respect was very important to ending violence, and that closely behind that was educating boys and girls. The white community also feeling hopeful, but again, as in the Asia Pacific Islander community, this was a complicated kind of hope. The Latino and Native American and African American communities, hope and inspiration, their top emotions. But for Asian Pacific Islanders and whites, the hope was tempered by the feeling that a higher feeling that we may never be able to end violence, although we still had a majority in each community that felt we could. So enormous richness, I think you agree. Probably the fastest tour of the landscape that you have had in a long time, but we are eager to get your insights, your experiences, your questions, and also very eager to continue this in an ongoing way, working with all of you through the MEV and NOVO, and not just have this be the one time we get to interact and talk with you in terms of this very, very rich data set. So Danielle, let me turn it back to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Celinda. So bear with me for a second. I'm going to change the meeting mode so that people can unmute themselves to ask questions. Hang on.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Great. So we have a couple of questions already teed up in the chat, and I think we'll start with those. And then if folks want to ask questions live, we're happy to hear your voices as well. And so after we deal with these couple questions, we'll invite you to unmute. So the first question, Celinda, comes from Russ Funk out of Kentucky. And Russ asks whether the barriers that you identified interact with each other. For example, does the degree to which people find getting involved emotionally draining impact how much more they need to know about what to do?
Oh, really, really astute question. And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So they do interact with each other. Emotionally draining actually interacted less with education and more with training. So people who are worried that this would be emotionally draining, triggering for themselves or others, really wanted training on how do you engage in this conversation? How do you start it? How do you deal with something being triggered? So yes, lots of interactions, and very astute question.
Great. And then a second question comes from Heather Debrow, since there was a low percentage of people who felt that violence was a top issue and many have more pressing concerns, she wondered if we asked any questions within the assessment around addressing oppression being a root cause to violence and other issues that are major concerns. She also said there seems to be a lot of gender language. Was there any LGBTQ representation in the survey? So a couple questions packed in there. You can see them, Celinda, in the chat box.
I do see them, and thank you. So really good questions. So LGBTQ representation is in the survey. The sample was not big enough to look at separately. It did, we raised it and looked at it in the focus groups as well, although we didn't do a separate focus group of LGBTQ people, but it did come up and was discussed, and there's definitely concern. The other thing that we saw is, we may have state legislatures in Congress who don't want to include LGBTQ. We do not have any real people who do not want to include it. They thought it was just ludicrous that this is not included. So just an enormous openness in the public to that kind of conversation and wanting to be educated and informed and inclusive about that. We did have some conversation about oppression, not in the survey so much, but more in the focus groups. It varied, as you might imagine, a great deal by the community that we were talking about and the vocabulary and the type of, educated, not educated, active, not active people even within the community. So there was some exploration of it, but clearly, and I know the cohorts feel very strongly about this, and Michelle, at some point you may want to speak more in depth, and Patti and others, that there are obviously huge root causes here in terms of oppression and racism and economic inequality and economic oppression, and we did not get in at that level in detail.
Great. Thank you, Celinda. Any other folks with questions, either via the chat box or you can hit *6 to unmute yourself?
So I see a question, Danielle, about education. What kind of education do people want? Okay. And I'm not trying to usurp your role, but just the question was, can we say more about what communities need in terms of education? What level of information did they want? So it's really a smart question because there are three different kinds of information, at least, that people wanted. What they didn't feel they needed particularly were statistics about what was going on in their community or that this was a problem. They felt they knew that. They knew what's going on in their community. They know what's going on in every community. They know it's a serious problem. While there was shock at the statistics, it was not, as you saw earlier, motivating to action. What they wanted was education. First of all, tell me about the issue. Like, what will make a difference? How can I make a difference? How does education work? Does education work for adults? Does it work for children? What kind of education? So people really remarkably at sea about how to get started, what kinds of actions would be efficacious, what can communities do, who can be partners in it. So that was one level, this just foundational level of, I need education about this issue. What does cause it? What can we do about it? A second kind of education that people wanted was what they called training, which was, okay, I've got my education, I've got my platform, I understand this basic issue, I understand the components, I understand how it's affecting people, all its manifestations, how it's in my community, etc. What I don't understand, but I'm not trained necessarily in how to use that knowledge. How do I start the conversation? How do I deal with what is triggering for me? How do I deal with what is triggering for other family members? How do I deal with what may come up in the conversation? And then the last thing people wanted was they want to be effective. If we're going to be involved in this, if we're going to get educated, take action, which we don't have time or money for, and also push other things out and get the training, then I need to know that it's making a difference. So people said, I want to report on the difference that my actions can make and the difference that others' actions can make.
A couple more questions came in, Celinda. I think we have time for both of these, and then we'll transition ahead. One question from Lisa in Oakland. Were there any other sectors that folks identified other than schools? I assume that means as kind of opportunities to get involved or places to get involved.
Yeah, so school was the one that people really loved, and library is an extension of that, because they felt this is a public setting where you can get publicly involved with kids who are not your own to make a difference, and the community can come together, and by the way, you can get parents too. But youth programs, libraries, all kinds of things like that. Girl Scouts, people thought, is an area that you can be involved in. African Americans really thought, were very aggressive about, we can bring this into all kinds of community activities. And they were the most proactive about saying, let's bring this into other community campaigns. People talked about some partnerships with businesses, including small businesses, and that came up in the Latino community because economic interests are seen as major community leaders there. Native Americans thought we need the education to be in every aspect of our community. That's how much of a problem we have. So we can't just isolate in the schools. We've got to have education and education of our young people every place that we can intersect with them. So schools was just a readily accessible, handy-dandy, no question about it, we could implement this there kind of go-to place. But out of that, people layered in other kinds of community. The people that had the hardest time, the community that had the hardest time imagining other places to go and was most education-oriented was the Asian Pacific Islander community. They were the most, not sure, this is still a private issue in our community. It shouldn't be, but it is, so not sure we want to go in all these other settings. But in the schools, yes, education, that's the orientation of our community. And if we can come in under the umbrella of educating our young people, we can really make some move here.
Great. Christy from Pittsburgh asks, so she's heard that it makes sense to start by asking individuals to start with a small action and build up to a harder one over time. She's wondering if that's something that you saw supported in the research.
It is something that we saw supported in the research, and it's something that we see supported in all of our activity. I will say this with one exception. The notion of being able to engage in a conversation with children and supporting a school program that did that, people were very ready to do. And I noticed in your question, Christy, you even said, you were thinking of that as a harder one you had to build up to. Not as much as we thought. We thought the same thing, but it did not appear that people thought that was such a hard thing. So I'll turn it, Danielle, over to you.
That's right. We're going to get one more in because we have just enough time, and then we will transition. One last question from Russ. You touched a lot on the differences between communities, but you didn't talk too much about the difference, if you saw any differences between men and women and how they responded to questions in the survey.
Really good question, Russ. So, yes, a lot of differences. In magnitude, though, more than rank order. So in almost everything we talked about, women were more willing than men to do it, more engaged about it, more willing to do it. But the rank order was quite similar. And the level of engagement of men was surprisingly high in most communities.
Great. All right. There was one other question in the queue, but I'm going to hold that one until we get to the discussion section at the end. And we're going to move along and talk a little bit about how you can use some of this in your work. So, Celinda, you're welcome to turn your webcam off if you want a little bit of a break. All right. So, Celinda gave you a fantastic overview of what the research found, and in a nutshell, people want to do more to help end violence against women and girls, but they need more help from us in order to do that. It would have been great if the research had identified a silver bullet that would motivate everyone to take action, and that doesn't really exist, right? It depends on particular audiences and their particular barriers. But one thing we did hear is that part of the issue is we as a movement need to be clearer about our overall vision and theory of change. And that will certainly take some work. People want to understand what their actions are adding up to and how they fit in. There are definitely some things that you can start doing now or do more of if you're doing them already to take the results of this research and apply it to the outreach and engagement you're doing every day. So I'm going to walk through some of those recommendations and also share some examples. Some will be from this field, some will be from other issues because it's helpful to learn, and we'll have a chance to hear from Patti and Ilene, who can share a little bit about how some of these things have played out in their own organizations. So first up, as Celinda talked about, statistics are a little complicated. The scope of the problem of violence against women, the statistics about that are very compelling to folks, and they can capture attention.
All attendees are muted.
But the problem is that they don't make the issue more of a priority in people's minds, nor do they make people more likely to act. This doesn't mean you can't use statistics, but it does mean you just want to be thoughtful about the best way to do so. And that really depends on where your audience is in relation to this work. Sometimes you might be dealing with a new audience that isn't yet as familiar with this issue, and that's where statistics might be helpful. Some things to think about, though, as you do use statistics with audiences like that, the most important thing is less is more. I think our instinct, particularly those of us that come from kind of social science backgrounds, is to make our case as strong as possible with as many numbers as we can, as much evidence as we can. The challenge with that is that it can be quite overwhelming to folks. And it means, in that case, your numbers don't really have nearly as much power. So focusing in on one strong statistic rather than many can actually be much more effective. The second thing is, anytime you can make that statistic more local to your community or your state, that's going to help with the personal connection that it has with folks. It'll make it more meaningful to them. And finally, the hope piece is really important. We are so fortunate that audiences are quite hopeful about this issue. We need to lean into that and bolster it up as much as possible. So especially when sharing statistics about the problem, pairing those with a hopeful message so that folks don't feel like the problem is insurmountable. Let me share an example. I think one of our presenters, they're the only ones that are unmuted, have some background noise. So if presenters who aren't speaking right now could mute themselves on your phone or by hitting *6, that would be terrific. Great. So this example comes from Jewish Women International. And I will confess, I would like it even more if it only had one statistic in it rather than two. But 2 is dramatically better than 12. The first statistic in the outline of the gun at the top talks about the scope of the problem. A woman in a domestic violence situation that includes a gun is 500% more likely to be killed. The statistic down in the purple outline focuses on the solution. And that's the part that I want to draw your attention to, because they include a statistic here in states that require a background check for every handgun sale. 38% fewer women are shot to death by intimate partners. So it talks about how this policy of having a background check has impact. That's really critical, showing people that change is possible and that particular policy has been proven to work. And then it pairs that statistic with a really clear ask, and we're going to be talking a lot about clear asks today. In this case, sign a petition to tell Congress to expand this policy. So this is a good example of how you can use a statistic and build in some hope, pair it with that telling people exactly what to do, and get the benefits of statistics in that way. Now, more often than not, you actually are going to be dealing with audiences that are aware of the problem. I think that's one of the takeaways from the research, is that audiences have more baseline awareness than we might think. And in that case, statistics aren't as helpful to you. You are going to get more bang from your outreach efforts by telling them exactly how they can help and showing them the impact their actions can have. And we're going to be sharing a number of examples about how to do this more specifically as I go on. But for now, here's an example that I really like from Share Our Strength's No Kid Hungry campaign to end child hunger. They have a really simple app, dine out at your favorite restaurant, and they pair that with very specific information about impact. So they focus on how much money has been raised through this effort, as well as the very specific impacts that money helps them have, connecting kids in need with nutritious food, educating and empowering low-income families, and shining a light on childhood hunger in America. So in this case, they're not actually sharing any statistics about the scope of the hunger problem. They're instead focusing on the ask and on what the impact of taking action will have. Celinda explained that there are some key barriers that are holding people back from taking action. Ending violence is not always their highest priority, and it can be pretty intimidating to take action for a variety of reasons. These barriers make many people feel like it's easier, in fact, not to take action. And we need to flip that and make it easier for people to act. So in many cases, this might start with raising the priority level they put on these issues, the amount of urgency and importance that they place on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll go into some of the more specific things that you can do to support action more directly. So increasing the priority of issues is no easy task. And if there was a silver bullet way to do it, we'd all be a lot more successful in elevating issues that we care about. But there are some strategies that can help. And one of those is lifting up real world stories. These stories take an issue from something that is abstract, that could happen, and they turn it into something that is happening here and now. And a really relevant example of that is how folks in the community elevated Marissa Alexander's story. And I'm sure all of you on the call today know this story even better than I do. But just in case, Marissa fired a warning shot to protect herself from her abusive husband, didn't injure anyone, and yet she was convicted of a gun crime and initially was sentenced to 20 years in prison. When that was compared with George Zimmerman's acquittal of killing Trayvon Martin using the stand your ground defense, the injustice that Marissa faced was unbelievable. And it sparked a national conversation on the intersection of domestic violence, incarceration, and race, and focused attention not just on Marissa's story, but also on other women who are in prison under similar circumstances. The telling of Marissa's story led to a number of different kinds of actions. There was fundraising efforts, there were marches and caravans in lots of locations around the U.S. The monument quilt, which is a picture you see in the upper right corner of your screen, is a crowdsourced collection of stories from thousands of survivors of rape and abuse, and that was displayed at the courthouse in the area where Marissa lived. The Move to End Violence community also took action around this in terms of highlighting Marissa's story in a video that focused on the intersection of race and gender justice. Ultimately, Marissa's conviction was overturned on appeal, though she did have to accept a plea deal to avoid a new trial. So this is one example of how a real-world story can raise the urgency and importance of this issue and help to make issues more front of mind. This community has a tremendous number of these stories to tell, and so there's an opportunity to do more of this to help increase the priority people are placing on these issues. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that as you tell more of those stories and as you make a problem more urgent and important, you also need to lean into hope. Stories get people to pay attention, but they can also make a problem seem insurmountable. So again, this piece about providing concrete examples of what can be done to help and the impact that the action can have, that's what helps really support hope that people have. So for example, this one comes from outside of this community from an organization called Kiva that provides microloans to people around the world. And their ultimate goal is to end poverty. And that is a huge problem that is not often seen at the top of people's priority list. Kiva tells the stories of people seeking loans and how those loans impact their lives. For example, in the bottom right of your screen, you see a photo of Makula, who sought a loan to add new weaving looms in her home, and she's now able to employ her husband as well as 2 other people. Her sons are able to attend school, and they focus on the ripple impact that the loans have. They pair that with a really specific ask about giving a $25 loan. So you have both something people can do that's concrete and that focus on impact. And then finally, one other piece of this puzzle around increasing priority and reducing risk focuses on how you can maximize the benefit that people perceive in the action you're trying to get them to take. If people feel like the benefit is really big, they are much more able to tolerate some risk around the action. And that benefit can be to them personally, it can be a larger societal benefit, it can be a combination. And that can really help to reduce, or not reduce, it can help people manage what that risk feels like, make them more tolerant of it. So for example, I got a postcard in the mail recently from the Avon Foundation asking me to consider joining the 39-mile walk to end breast cancer. And my first thought in looking at this is 39 miles feels pretty darn risky. I might not be in good enough shape. What if the weather is really hot? Gosh, the weather in DC is so crazy. I'm probably going to get blisters. I have a feeling they might make me sleep in a tent. Seems a little scary to me. And so I have a lot of risk around this. I have a number of barriers. And so Avon does a couple of things that are really great in this piece of marketing around the walk. They focus on the personal benefits that I will get of training my body, of bragging rights, that I'll be fierce, that I'll do something that I never thought I could do. They also focus on the benefits to others. How is this going to help people who are surviving chemo and radiation? This is going to raise funds to crush breast cancer. So they really drive home the benefits to make the risk seem a little less risky. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is how you can make action a little bit easier. We've mentioned a few times the need to have clear asks and more support for action. So I'm going to unpack these concepts just a little bit more, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ilene Stohl at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who's going to share an example of how they put these strategies to work. That'll be a good starting point for the conversation I see happening in the chat to have more sharing of success stories. We'll get to hear a couple on this webinar and a few more hopefully in the discussion, and then perhaps Move to End Violence can facilitate additional sharing after the webinar. So first up, this question of really concrete asks. The first thing to think about is making them as clear and specific as possible. I think sometimes we get pretty squishy on our asks. We either ask for things that are really big, like end violence. And while I'd like to end violence, I actually have no idea how to do that. Sometimes we ask for things that are really vague, like support us. And that's a problem because I actually can say yes to that. I can support you all day long, but not actually do anything, not actually take any action. So clear, specific, actionable, something that I can say yes or no to. The next piece is that point around doable. And I believe it was Christy who had the question earlier. I may have that wrong. Somebody in the chat had the question earlier about kind of laddering your ask. And I think that's a great strategy. Starting with something small and doable and working up to something more challenging or takes more time or more investment is a great way to go. It's really important, though, to do that one at a time. And that brings us to the last piece, avoid the menu. You want to ask one thing. Just like in a restaurant, when the menu has too many items on it and you feel paralyzed by indecision, presenting your audiences with a multitude of asks doesn't actually make them more likely to pick one. It makes them more likely to do nothing. So a clear ask, one that's doable, and sticking to just one. Those are pretty straightforward things you can do to tell them specifically how they can help. And here's an example. Are our presenters all muted? Michelle, can you hear me? Is there anything you can do to deal with the muting situation on your end? I'll leave it in your capable hands. Okay. So this example comes from a member of our community, Futures Without Violence, and was a very specific and entry point ask that they used for a campaign around Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. And they very specifically asked teens to change their profile picture or their background picture on Facebook as a way of starting a conversation with their friends around this issue. Now, we all know that this sort of online activism isn't going to be the silver bullet thing that ends violence, to be frank, but it can be a good example of a starting point early ask that helps get people engaged, and then you can engage over time. The next piece of this that we wanted to touch on is about support. And this is a place where it's hard to tell you, if you just provide this kind of support, that will take care of it, and your audience will take the action you want. Because the kind of support and action needs really depends on the audience. And so this may be a place where you need to do some additional research into your own specific community to understand what kind of support would be most helpful. Another possibility here is to just offer as many different kinds of support as you can. In this case, unlike with needing a single ask, the more support you can offer, the better, and they can choose from that. And then finally, I think we don't often think about the idea of talking about the impact your action would have as a kind of support. But it's really important for people to feel like what they're about to do has the ability to make a difference. If it doesn't, they're not very likely to do it. So don't forget about the impact piece as a type of support that you might offer, maybe by sharing a story about how a similar action was successful, or circling back with them after they take action to share an update. It can be an ongoing conversation, but that impact piece is very important. So I'm going to invite Ilene to open up her webcam and unmute herself. Hi, Ilene.
Hi.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about your organization and the role that you play there?
Sure. I work for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we are a state coalition like so many of the folks that are calling in, and we have a membership of 74 programs across Washington State, including a very diverse group of folks. We have tribal programs, we have culturally specific organizations, and other domestic violence programs who are providing direct support to victims and their families and survivors. And then I work as the prevention coordinator, and I just want to acknowledge that I have learned so much from the folks that are actually on this call, so I really feel like this is a product of a lot of collaboration and learning that I've done with the folks that are actually, calling in today. But I coordinate our efforts, and we really started prevention sort of late at the coalition and have tried to catch up to where our member programs were and where the field was, and so we just feel like we're constantly learning and figuring out kind of a way to approach this. And so this was the example that we're going to talk about, was sort of one of our toes in that has been one of the things that has lasted. Some other toes we put in haven't lasted as well.
Great. And tell us a little bit about this specific campaign that we see some materials from up on the screen.
Sure. So this cards came out of some early work that we did at the Coalition to sort of get a sense of what our prevention work should look like. When we first started, we heard from folks, we'd say, we want to do prevention, and people would always say, yes, we want to do prevention. That sounds great. What is it? And we didn't really know, and so we thought, well, let's kind of start more internally or more inward in the movement. And so we invited advocates and their own teenage children to come to a summer camp. And in doing the summer camp, we really learned that even though all of us advocates really have a desire to talk with our own kids about healthy relationships and that we want to do prevention, we actually haven't figured out how to do it. And so we thought we'd start there. And so these How's Your Relationship cards really grew out of that interest in helping us all have those conversations in a really simple way. And so that was really how it started. And then we hoped that our audience would be our membership, of course, but then the broader community. And so we eventually, when we put these out, we had them in our annual report. And so to a bunch of folks that are sort of connected to our work, but maybe don't know exactly what we do, but then also at our 5K, which is our Refuse to Abuse 5K that we partner with the Seattle Mariners. So we had over 1,200 people that year get these cards when they came to do a fun run.
Great. And talk to us a little bit about how the cards incorporate the strategies of having a clear ask and providing support to make following through on the ask easier.
Yeah, so we heard loud and clear from folks that people were interested in having conversations with their kids or with young people in their lives, but they didn't know how to do it. And so the clear ask was, we want you to have those conversations, and here's how. So the first step that we did was we really tried to make it developmentally appropriate. So each of the cards, and I actually have, you can sort of see they're on like a keychain ring, and you can flip through to find the right developmental age that you're looking for. And so it starts from age 2, and it goes all the way up to adults. And so we wanted it to be very clear that you could have conversations with anyone in your life, but that you would have to choose which conversation to have. Because one of the things that we found, and I think actually as a parent myself, it was overwhelming to think that I'm going to have the same conversation with teenagers that I want to have with my younger kids who are school age. So that was the first place we started. We also wanted it to be really clear where to start. So not just have a conversation, but here's a script for how to get you started. And so the cards actually include kind of a beginning script, and then each card for each developmental age has 5 questions that you can ask. And then the other piece, we really wanted it to be hopeful. So we didn't want to focus on, run away scared, relationships are scary. Instead, we wanted to focus on, look, you're going to have relationships your whole life, and they're what makes life so beautiful and worth living. And so this is a great, fun thing to chat about love with those you love. And so have it be really hopeful was one of the ways that we had to do that as well.
Terrific. And last question for you, Ilene, is what kind of results have you seen from this effort?
Well, we've had a really good response. We've heard from a lot of programs that they're using them in their community meetings. We've also heard that some folks are even giving them at their child advocacy centers. When any family comes in for just information or support, they just automatically give them to families just to encourage conversations. We also, the wonderful thing that was totally unintentional that just happened was that they're very pleasing to look at, and I just love touching them. And so what we found is if we just leave them out, people will take them and immediately engage in them and start reading through them. And there's little games, just like a little word search on them. They're just fun. And so what we found is that it kind of is ongoing, and that we don't actually have an end point where these won't be something that we use, but instead that we hope to figure out more ways to help people continue to have those conversations and be really clear with folks about how to continue using them, that this is the start of a conversation, but obviously we want it to continue, and that even just having these conversations with folks builds the foundation that you're one of those people that they can come to talk about anything in their life.
Great. And judging by the chat box, people are excited about the cards, which is fantastic.
Oh,
we'll be including a link to them in the follow-up that goes out after this webinar, so they'll be able to take a look at all the cards, not just the 4 we have on the screen.
Great, and I love these cards. I'm always happy to talk about it with other folks if they want to contact me offline too.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ilene. All right, I'm going to move on to the last point that I'm going to make, and then Patti will join me. As Celinda mentioned, Our research looked at similarities and differences in the motivations of different communities to take action. And one of the takeaways is there's a lot of common ground, but that's paired with the takeaway that there certainly are some differences. We hope that the research gives you a good starting point and base of information to draw on as you plan your own outreach efforts. But in many cases, you also may need to do some additional research. And Patti from Casa de Esperanza is going to share a story with us about how her organization has done just that. There's also going to be some additional resources on the Move to End Violence blog about how you can put research within the reach of your own organization. Patti, thank you so much for joining us. I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
You're welcome. Hi, everybody.
It's fantastic to see your face, but we want to hear your wonderful story as well. So just in case folks on the phone aren't familiar with Casa de Esperanza, tell us a little bit about the organization and about your role there.
Well, Casa de Esperanza is a national Latina organization. We were founded in 1982 as a shelter program here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we now focus on services for Latinas, direct services for Latinas and their children here in the Twin Cities area, including shelter. We also do leadership development and community engagement work here in the Twin Cities, and then nationally public policy, research, and training and technical assistance. As Chief Executive Officer, I oversee all the organizational programming, operations, and strategic direction.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about this research that you did to inform the Te Invito campaign. Why did you do it, and what did you learn?
Well, we have worked with Latino men in a variety of ways over the years, but we've also known through our work on the ground that we needed to do more, that there was a way to encourage and engage with Latino men in a much stronger manner. And from time to time, men would tell us that. So because we believe in the power of community listening sessions, that's what we did. We had a listening session with Latina women and Latino men, and it was a really rich conversation. And in that conversation, we asked, what would it take for Latino men to get involved? Should they be involved in this work to end domestic violence? And overwhelmingly, especially from the men, they said, well, yes, but it would be great to be invited. We're not invited to be part of this work. And both women and men said, and you know what, men listen to other men. So that's kind of where we began this work.
Great. And so how did what you found in the research impact how you put the campaign together?
Well, based on what we learned, we decided to develop a campaign that really provided an opportunity for a diverse group of Latino men to speak directly to other men. So we brought together over 3 recording sessions, 15 Latino community leaders, and you can see a couple of them in the pictures here. And we created videos of them responding to 2 questions. Why is it important for Latino men to be involved in ending domestic violence and violence against women and girls? And if you were to invite someone to join you in this work, what would you say? And so this campaign really focuses on their images and their words through PSAs, through posters, through tear sheets, small business handout cards, etc. And then all the materials. For us, it was important as a national organization and resource center to create all the materials in a way that could be adapted for other organizations who wanted to introduce a Te Invito campaign in their communities.
Great. And so far, what have the results of the campaign been?
Well, locally, it's been great. Many of the men carry the little business kind of image cards with information on the back of how they can get involved and how to contact Casa de Esperanza. And we've really had more success with Latino men getting involved in our leadership development work and then creating community action projects. And nationally, the response has been tremendous. We put out an invitation for organizations who wanted to implement a Te Invito campaign in their own communities, and we had approximately 50 respondents. And so we've selected 10 organizations and 7 coalitions to be part of this kind of initial project. And right now we're helping them to adapt the materials to localize it with their organization, their numbers, et cetera, for the prevention work that they are able to really invite men to participate in. So I'm excited because we're getting lots of great feedback.
That's terrific. Patti, thank you so much for joining us. You can actually leave your webcam up because I'm going to invite the other presenters to bring their webcams back up as well. And as they do that, I'm going to change the meeting option.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Great. So we have about 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes to hear, and we'd love to hear from you guys who have joined us today. What is resonating with you about this? What of these strategies have you tried and have worked well? What doesn't match your experience? And do you have any plans to put this into use? I know there's also been a lot of interest in the chat with establishing a learning group. So if people have additional suggestions on that, if you have any remaining clarifying questions, we're happy to take those as well. This is really a chance to hear from you and to talk with your colleagues. *6 to unmute. Or you can chat your comments and your questions. Well, I know that we had a question that we left in the queue from the last round. I'm going to scroll back up and find it.
I actually have it written down.
Oh, you have it down? Great.
Actually, yeah, I actually, sorry, I didn't know who asked it, but it was asked, is there any research that shows that an increase in education actually leads to change in behavior? Does teaching kids about respect in schools lead to a change in behavior outside of school, at home?
I'm going to punt that to other folks because that's not the kind of research that we've done. I don't know, Patti, perhaps if you have some sense of that.
Well, I don't have, well, I have stories. You know, we do a lot of work with Latino teens, girls and boys, and our leaders, youth leaders, had a conference in February with 65 girls and boys, and we heard from one of the youth that attended the conference. It's not one of our youth leaders, it was a participant who attended the conference who followed up about a week later and basically said what she learned in that conference allowed for her not only to understand her school relationships, but to understand what was happening in her own home and to be able to, you know, have more insight about that and to be able to bring resources into her home and the way she relates to her sibling, her brother, I believe. So that was, I mean, it's just a small example of how sometimes when you open up ideas and information and resources to teens and even younger children, they are able to really take that in. We've got youth leaders that take on community action projects, and they impact other youth along the way who didn't know anything about how to talk about, you know, violence in their relationships, how to talk about healthy relationships, how to talk about when they feel bad because someone has bullied them. So, I mean, I think education works wonders, but I don't have any solid kind of formal research myself. There may be some, obviously, that my staff has.
Thank you, Patti.
Mm-hmm.
Alexis from Columbia, Maryland, near Celinda's and my backyard, asks, can you say more about being clear on your vision, theory of change, and how that relates to giving your supporters updates on impact? I can start that and then see if anybody else wants to chime in. As an organization, and then more broadly as we think about our collective actions as a movement, it's really important that we can sort of tell a story about this is the future that we are driving toward. This is the future we're trying to create. And these are the major steps that we think it's going to need to take to get there. And then when you're trying to get someone to take action to support one of those steps, you can say how the specific action fits in to the particular step that ladders up to the vision that you have. It's not a long-winded theory of change. It's not like when you whip out your flow chart and walk them through all the boxes and arrows, which I generally wouldn't recommend as a communication strategy. But it is being able to tell it almost as a story. This is what we hope to happen. This is how we think we'll get there. And this is the role you're going to play. And as organizations, you can do that individually. And frankly, as a movement, having a better story about that is something that Move to End Violence is hoping to work on over the coming year or two. Celinda or Patti or Ilene or Michelle, anything to add?
No, that was wonderful, I thought.
Great. Christy from Pittsburgh has a question. She said comment in the question. It's helpful to hear the comment about giving concrete suggestions and starting with one ask. Can you say more about starter asks for people who want to get involved? I think there, from my experience in helping nonprofits motivate people to take action across a number of issues, is exactly what's going to be the best starter ask may depend on the audience. And as Celinda said, we had some really good information from the study about things that people are willing to do, and it's exciting that they're willing to do more than just, for instance, change their profile picture online. There's a real willingness to talk to children, to sign a petition. Sign a petition is certainly something I would consider normally to be a pretty early stage ask. They're willing to share information in conversation with family and friends. For the right audience, those sort of online steps can be good ones. I don't know, those of you who are on Facebook are probably seeing your friends' profile pictures turn red this week as a result of the Human Rights Campaign effort to draw more attention and have more folks stand up for the rights around marriage equality as the Supreme Court hears this argument. But otherwise, it may depend a little bit. I think the most important takeaway of that is there are some of these asks that are going to be really hard for folks. Attend a meeting, things that require their time, things that require their money. So to the extent that you want to pursue asks like that, it makes sense to use those on your more engaged audiences or to get folks more engaged first through some of the easier actions and then move to those over time.
I would just add to that two things. One is, I think a lot of folks, maybe not so much in this movement, perhaps in other movements, think that asking for a $5 contribution is a starter ask. And it's interesting that when people thought of this movement, that did not seem like a starter ask to them at all and kind of shut them down rather than engage them. The second thing I think that needs more exploration, and it would be great both in the learning group and in the practical spin-outs of the learning group, Michelle and Danielle, to have people experiment. Since people are so willing to have these conversations with young people and support programs, what is the starter ask in that area? Because that is not normally an area we would think of as a starter area. We would think of that as down the road, and yet people are really poised to want to do this. So what is a starter ask in that domain? I don't think we completely know, and it would be a wonderful area to have programs experiment and share their experiences.
Great. We have a question for Patti from Chandra in Oakland. Patti, what were some of the strategies for engaging the men that you involved in your campaign? Were they shy about doing the videos and the posters?
Amazingly, the men were invited. What we started with is the men were invited by the people they might have known best. So it's not just that the program coordinator had to do the inviting. It might mean that the project coordinator invited someone. Maybe one of the other men that's been involved with us invited some other men. Men invited men, especially those that have been part of the discussion, the information session. decided right away that they wanted to be involved, so they were willing to invite other men. We reached out to some key men in our community to see if they would invite a few people. So they knew they were coming together to help us create something about messages for other men. And when we got there, there was some discussion about videography, and were they willing to do this? And again, we did not write scripts. This was all in their own words, so I think they felt very comfortable. And then we worked with them to pull out the messages so that it wasn't just a one-way relationship. They gave us information, and then we asked them to go. We were going to create it. The men were part of what got created, and I think that's what made it more of an inclusive, engaging process. And, when you've got people around you that are encouraging you, especially other men, we didn't see any hesitancy at all.
That's terrific. Final call for any questions or comments before we close this out. One for Celinda. What stood out as maybe the biggest one or two takeaways that came out of the research? Where do you think people would have the strongest impact? Where should they start?
Wow, what a great ending question. So the thing that stood out to me the most, honestly, was that the dominant emotion was hope, and how hopeful people were, and that is the starting point that we should build on. That was just, I think, enormously energizing, because it is a movement that's can be very hard work, and obviously it can invoke a lot of emotions that can be very draining over time. So that was amazing to me and very exciting. The real opportunity for an education campaign for young girls and boys, and just the total readiness of the public to take this on. Because I can easily imagine the reverse happening, right? That people would say, oh, I don't want my kids exposed to that. No, this is a private conversation. I don't want this to get started too early. We don't have time for this in class. We got to have math and science and that. I mean, there's just an amazing number of ways that we can imagine the findings would have been the opposite. So I think that this movement is intersecting with the public at a place where they are really, really ready to move, and I think that's very exciting.
Great. Well, Michelle, may I turn it over to you for some closing remarks?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank Danielle and Patti and Ilene and Celinda for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge and experience. I think if you've been following along on the chat, I think you'll realize that people are taking away quite a few learnings from today. The second thing is I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's a 90-minute commitment on your part, and I very much appreciate that. And it looks like there's a number of people who are eager to continue the conversations, and so I've collected those names, and we'll circulate information to you guys. Almost immediately following this webinar, you'll hear from us with a survey. It's a very quick survey, and we would encourage you to take it. It helps us to shape future surveys and learn what things we can improve and what things you would like to hear from us. And then tomorrow you will hear from Move to End Violence via email with follow-up links. We'll give you a link to the No Mas research that was referenced, to Washington State Coalition's cards that Ilene talked about, as well as a link to the campaign that Patti talked about. In addition, I will send you a link to the webinar. Today's webinar is recorded and will be hosted forever and ever on the Move to End Violence website at movetoendviolence.org/research. But again, I'll send that in an email tomorrow. I encourage you to share what you've learned today, including the webinar, with friends and folks in your networks. We'd love to have as many people as possible benefit from what we've learned. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone on the phone.